Daniel wiped the kitchen counter for the third time that morning. Not because it was dirty, but because he needed something to do with his hands. The Henderson mansion was always spotless thanks to his mother Rosa, who had been their head housekeeper for almost 18 years now. 18 years of polishing silver, arranging flowers, and making sure everything was perfect for a family that barely noticed she existed. He was 17 now, and this mansion had been his whole world. While other kids grew up in apartments or houses with backyards, Daniel grew up in the servants' quarters of the estate worth more than he could imagine. He knew every corner of this place, every squeaky floorboard, every window that stuck, every room that caught the afternoon sun just right. But there was one room that meant more to him than all the others combined. The music room. It sat at the east end of the mansion, with tall windows that overlooked the gardens. And right in the center of that room was a Steinway grand piano, black and glossy, worth more than most people's cars. Daniel had been drawn to it since he was a little kid, back when his legs were too short to reach the pedals. The Henderson kids had taken lessons on that piano for years. Expensive lessons with teachers who drove up in luxury cars and carried leather briefcases. Daniel would sometimes catch glimpses of those lessons while helping his mother dust the hallways. He'd stand outside the door, listening to scales and arpeggios, watching through the crack as small hands stumbled over keys. The Henderson children eventually lost interest, the way rich kids often do with things that come too easily. The piano sat unused most days now, except for the nights when Daniel would sneak in. It started when he was 12. His mother worked late shifts 3 times a week, staying until midnight to prepare things for the next day. The Hendersons would be asleep by 10, and the house would fall into this deep, peaceful quiet. That's when Daniel would slip out of their small room behind the kitchen and make his way to the music room. The first time he pressed a key, he held his breath, terrified the sound would wake someone. But nothing happened. No footsteps, no angry voices, just that one pure note hanging in the air. He taught himself slowly, painfully, one note at a time. He couldn't afford lessons, couldn't even afford books at first. But the public library had sheet music, and Daniel would check out whatever they had. He'd study the pages during his lunch breaks, memorizing the symbols, teaching himself to read the language of music like it was a secret code. The internet helped too. Free tutorials, videos of performances he'd watch on the old phone his mother had given him. He'd watch a section 10, 20, 50 times, then try to copy it in the middle of the night when no one could hear his mistakes. It took him 5 years to get good. Really good. The kind of good where his fingers knew where to go before his brain could think about it. Where he could hear a piece once and figure out how to play it. Where the music didn't feel like something he was doing, but something that was just flowing through him, but nobody knew. How could they? He was the maid's son. He wasn't supposed to have talents or dreams. He was supposed to be grateful for the hand-me-down clothes and the roof over his head. Today was different, though. Today the mansion was in complete chaos, and it had nothing to do with regular cleaning. The Hendersons were throwing their annual charity gala, which was really just an excuse for rich people to show off to other rich people while pretending to care about a cause. The house was swarming with people Daniel had never seen before. Caterers carrying trays, florists with massive arrangements, technicians setting up sound systems and lighting. Mrs. Henderson was in her element, directing everyone like a general commanding an army. She lived for these events, for the chance to prove to her social circle that she had the biggest house, the best taste, the most important connections. This year's event was special, though. They had a guest of honor, a pianist named Julian Ashworth. Daniel had heard of him, of course. Everyone who knew anything about classical music had heard of Julian Ashworth. He was 23, a graduate of one of those fancy music schools where tuition cost more than most people made in a year. He'd won some big international competition recently, and now he was touring around, playing for wealthy audiences who probably couldn't tell the difference between Mozart and Beethoven. Julian arrived that afternoon with 3 other people. Daniel wasn't sure if they were assistants or friends or what, but they all had that same polished look. Expensive clothes that looked casual but probably cost a fortune. Perfect hair, the kind of confidence that comes from never having to worry about money. Daniel was helping arrange chairs in the ballroom when Julian walked in to check out the piano. He moved like he owned the place, his shoes clicking on the marble floor. He sat down at the Steinway, played a few scales, then stood up with this look on his face. "It's adequate," he said to Mrs. Henderson, who was hovering nearby. "Not what I'm used to, but it'll work for an audience like this." Daniel felt something twist in his chest. That piano was beautiful. That piano was perfect. That piano had been his teacher, his friend, his escape for 5 years. And this guy was dismissing it like it was some cheap keyboard. He must have been staring because Julian noticed him. Their eyes met across the ballroom and Julian's expression changed. Not to friendliness, but to this sort of amused curiosity, like he'd spotted something unexpected. "Does the help know something about pianos?" Julian asked. He wasn't being mean exactly, but there was this tone in his voice, like he was making a joke that only he understood. Mrs. Henderson appeared out of nowhere, her hand suddenly on Daniel's shoulder, her nails digging in just slightly. "Daniel has work to do," she said with that fake sweet voice she used when other people were around. "Don't you, Daniel?" He nodded, not trusting himself to speak, and let her guide him away. But not before he caught Julian's smirk. Back in the kitchen, his mother was coordinating with the catering staff. She looked tired already and the party hadn't even started. Rosa had worked for the Hendersons since before Daniel was born. She'd been pregnant with him when she'd taken this job, a single mother desperate for stability and a place to stay. The Hendersons had given her both, and in return, she'd given them 18 years of perfect service. "You okay?" she asked him during a brief quiet moment. "Yeah," he lied. "Just a long day." She studied his face the way mothers do, seeing past the words to what he wasn't saying. "Stay out of trouble tonight," she said softly. "Please. This event is important to them." He knew what she meant. "Don't be visible. Don't draw attention. Don't remind these people that poor folks like us exist in their world. Be a ghost." Daniel had been a ghost his whole life. He'd perfected it. The art of moving through rooms without being noticed, of hearing conversations he wasn't supposed to hear, of existing in the spaces between other people's lives. But that piano called to him. Even now, with the ballroom filling up with chairs and decorations, even with Julian Ashworth's dismissive words still echoing in his head, all Daniel could think about was the music hiding inside that instrument. Music that Julian would play tonight for people who didn't really care, people who would clap politely and drink champagne and forget about it by tomorrow. Daniel had spent 5 years learning to speak the language of that piano. 5 years of stolen midnights and aching fingers and the constant fear of being caught. 5 years of loving something he was never supposed to touch. And tonight he would have to stand in the corner in his server's uniform and watch someone else play it. Watch them take for granted something he would give anything to claim as his own. He picked up a tray of champagne glasses and headed toward the ballroom. The party was about to begin. The ballroom transformed into something from a magazine by 7 o'clock. Crystal chandeliers threw light across everything, making the whole room sparkle. Women in evening gowns that cost more than Daniel's mom made in 6 months drifted through the space like colorful birds. Men in tuxedos stood in clusters talking about stocks and vacation homes and things Daniel could only pretend to understand. Daniel moved between them with his tray, offering champagne and appetizers. It was strange how invisible you could become when you were serving people. They'd take a glass right from your hand and continue their conversation like you weren't even there, like you were just a moving piece of furniture. He'd learned to use it to his advantage over the years. You'd be surprised what people say when they think the help can't hear or doesn't matter. Business deals, family gossip, secrets they'd never admit to in public. Daniel had heard it all. Tonight, though, he wasn't paying attention to the gossip. His eyes kept drifting to the piano and to Julian Ashworth, who stood in the center of a crowd like a celebrity, which Daniel supposed he was, at least in this world. Julian was telling a story about his time at Juilliard, something about a professor who'd made him play the same piece 200 times until it was perfect. The crowd around him laughed at all the right moments, impressed by his dedication, his talent, his obvious brilliance. Mrs. Henderson was in heaven. She kept touching Julian's arm, laughing too loud at his jokes, making sure everyone knew that she was the one who'd brought him here. This was her triumph, her social victory. At 8 o'clock, Mrs. Henderson clinked her glass to get everyone's attention. The crowd settled down, turning toward her with expectant faces. "Thank you all so much for coming tonight," she began, launching into a speech about the charity they were supposedly supporting. Daniel had heard versions of this speech at every gala for years. It was always the same. Lots of words about making a difference and giving back, followed by an auction where rich people bought overpriced items to show off to each other. And now, Mrs. Henderson continued, her voice rising with excitement, I'm thrilled to introduce tonight's special guest, a young virtuoso who recently won the International Piano Competition in Vienna. Please welcome Julian Ashworth. The applause was immediate and enthusiastic. Julian stood, smoothed his jacket, and walked to the piano with the kind of easy confidence that comes from a lifetime of being told you're special. He sat down, adjusted the bench, flexed his fingers. The room went completely quiet. Even the servers along the walls stopped moving. Then he started to play. Daniel had to admit it was impressive. Julian had chosen Rachmaninoff, one of the more challenging composers, and his fingers moved across the keys with technical precision. Every note was clean, every phrase perfectly measured. It was the kind of performance that would make teachers proud and judges award high scores. But something was missing. Daniel couldn't quite name it at first. The technique was flawless. The dynamics were correct. All the pieces were there. But as he listened, he realized what bothered him. Julian was playing at the piano, not with it. He was executing the piece like a well-trained machine, hitting all the right marks, but there was no soul in it. No real feeling. It was perfect and empty at the same time. The audience didn't seem to notice, or maybe they didn't care. When Julian finished, the applause was thunderous. People stood up, shouting praise. Mrs. Henderson looked like she might burst with pride. Julian stood and took a bow, soaking in the attention. Then he started talking. Thank you, he said, his voice carrying across the ballroom. You know, people often ask me what makes a great pianist. And I tell them it's not just about practice. It's about breeding, about growing up in an environment that nurtures musical excellence. It's about having the right teachers from a young age, the right instruments, the right opportunities. Daniel felt his jaw tighten. There's a natural separation, Julian continued, warming to his subject, between those who are born for music and those who can only appreciate it from a distance. It's not elitist to say that. It's just reality. You can't teach greatness. You can't fake talent. You either have it in your blood or you don't. He paused and his eyes swept across the room, landing briefly on the servers standing along the walls. The look was dismissive, casual, like he was acknowledging furniture. Some people are meant to create, Julian said, and others are meant to serve. That's just how the world works. A few people in the audience shifted uncomfortably, but most nodded along. Daniel felt something hot and angry building in his chest. 5 years of midnight practice sessions flashed through his mind. 5 years of teaching himself because nobody thought he was worth teaching. 5 years of hiding his talent because people like Julian had decided who was allowed to have dreams. His mother caught his eye from across the room. She must have seen something in his face because she gave him a tiny shake of her head. A warning. Don't do anything stupid. But Daniel's feet were already moving. He stepped forward from his position against the wall. His heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. The tray in his hand suddenly felt too heavy, so he set it down on a nearby table. I'd like to play something. His voice didn't sound like his own. It was steadier than he felt, louder than he intended. But it cut through the chatter of the room like a knife. The ballroom went silent. Heads turned. People stared. Mrs. Henderson's face went through several emotions in quick succession. Confusion, then recognition, then horror, then anger. Her face turned red enough that Daniel worried she might actually have a heart attack. Julian turned slowly, like he couldn't believe what he'd heard. When he saw Daniel standing there in his server's uniform, his expression shifted to something like amused disbelief. Then he laughed. It wasn't a friendly laugh. It was sharp and cutting, the kind of laugh that was meant to make someone feel small, and it spread. Other people in the crowd started laughing too, though some looked more uncomfortable than amused. I'm sorry, Julian said, though he didn't sound sorry at all. Did the help just challenge me to a piano competition? More laughter. Louder now. Someone near the back made a joke Daniel couldn't hear, and a whole group burst into giggles. Mrs. Henderson was already moving toward him, her heels clicking rapidly on the marble floor. Daniel, she hissed, her smile frozen in place for the benefit of the guests. What do you think you're doing? Get back to the kitchen right now or I swear, let him play. Everyone turned. The voice had come from Mr. Henderson, who'd been sitting quietly in a chair near the window all evening. He rarely spoke at these events, usually letting his wife run the show. but now he was standing up, walking toward the center of the room. "Robert," Mrs. Henderson said, her voice strained. "This is ridiculous. He's embarrassing us in front of our guests." "Let him play," Mr. Henderson repeated, his voice calm but firm. "What harm could it do? If he's terrible, we'll all have a story to tell. And if he's not—" He trailed off, leaving the sentence unfinished. Mrs. Henderson looked like she wanted to argue, but she couldn't contradict her husband in front of everyone, her mouth pressed into a thin line. Julian was still smiling, but now it was a different kind of smile. Patronizing. Like an adult indulging a child's silly request. "You know what? Why not? This should be entertaining." He gestured toward the piano with exaggerated politeness. "Please be my guest." The crowd settled in, their faces expectant. Daniel could see it in their eyes. They were waiting for a spectacle, waiting for him to fail so they could laugh and feel superior, and go home with a funny story about the maid's son who thought he could play piano. His mother was still staring at him from across the room. She looked terrified that he was about to humiliate himself, terrified that they'd both lose their jobs, terrified of what this moment might cost them. But Daniel was tired of being afraid, tired of hiding, tired of pretending he was less than he was. He walked toward the piano, and the crowd parted for him like he was carrying something contagious. Every step felt too loud, too obvious. His worn shoes looked shabby against the polished floor. His server's uniform was wrinkled from hours of work, but when he reached the Steinway, when his hands hovered over those familiar keys, everything else fell away. This piano had been his teacher, his confidant, his escape. He knew every key, every sound, every possibility it held. He sat down on the bench, adjusted his posture, took a breath, and in that moment, before his fingers touched the keys, Daniel made a decision. He wasn't going to play something safe. He wasn't going to choose an easy piece that would just prove he could carry a tune. He was going to play La Campanella, Liszt's La Campanella, one of the hardest pieces in classical piano, the kind of piece that separated good pianists from great ones, the kind of piece that students at fancy conservatories spent years perfecting. Julian would know what it was the moment he heard the opening notes. And he'd know that Daniel was either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid. Maybe both. Daniel placed his fingers on the keys, felt their familiar coolness beneath his skin, and began to play. The first notes rang out clear and bright like bells cutting through the silence. Daniel felt rather than saw the shift in the room. Those opening notes of La Campanella were unmistakable. Anyone who knew anything about piano recognized them immediately. He heard someone gasp, heard Julian's sharp intake of breath, but Daniel didn't look up. Couldn't look up. All his focus had narrowed down to this moment, these keys, this music that had been living inside him for so long. His fingers flew across the keyboard. The piece demanded it. La Campanella wasn't just technically difficult. It was brutally, impossibly complex. The right hand had to jump across octaves while maintaining a delicate melody. The left hand provided harmonic support while the pedals shaped the sound. Every element had to work together perfectly or the whole thing fell apart. Daniel had practiced this piece for 2 years. 2 years of midnight sessions, of aching hands, of playing the same measures over and over until his fingers knew them better than his own name. He'd learned it from YouTube videos and sheet music from the library, teaching himself without a teacher to correct him or guide him. Now all those hours poured out through his hands. The smirks in the audience started fading. Daniel could feel it even without looking. The energy in the room was changing. People had stopped whispering, stopped shuffling. They were actually listening now. Because what was coming out of that piano wasn't just correct notes. It wasn't just technical execution. It was alive. Every phrase Daniel played carried something with it. The longing he'd felt standing outside the music room as a child. The joy of discovering he could create beauty with his own hands. The frustration of having to hide his gift. The anger at being told he didn't belong. All of it poured into the music, giving it depth and emotion that went beyond the notes on a page. This was the difference between Julian's performance and his. Julian played the piano like he was solving a math problem. All the answers were correct, but there was no passion in it, no risk. He played it safe because he'd been taught that perfect execution was what mattered. But Daniel played like someone who had something to prove. Like someone who'd been invisible his whole life and was finally being seen. He played with everything he had, holding nothing back. The technical demands of the piece kept escalating. Rapid passages that required perfect finger independence, leaps that could easily result in wrong notes, sections where both hands had to cross over each other while maintaining different rhythms. It was the kind of playing that should have taken decades of professional training. Yet Daniel's hands knew exactly where to go. Not because he'd been taught by expensive instructors, but because he'd taught himself to listen, really listen, to understand not just what the notes were, but what they meant, what Liszt had been trying to say when he composed this impossible, beautiful piece. The ballroom had fallen into complete silence now. Even the caterers had stopped moving, standing frozen with their trays. The guests who'd been laughing a few minutes ago were leaning forward, their expressions transformed from mockery to something like awe. Daniel reached the middle section, where the melody slowed and became almost tender before building back up to the final rush. This was the part that always made him think of his mother. The quiet sacrifice of her life, working in the shadows so he could have a chance at something better. The gentle strength that kept her going through years of being invisible to the people she served. He poured that into the music too. Let it shape the phrases, give them weight and meaning. And then came the final section. The grand finish that required every ounce of technique and stamina. His fingers were tired now. 5 years of practice had built up strength. But this piece pushed even professional pianists to their limits. Daniel could feel the burn in his forearms, the strain in his wrists. But he didn't slow down. Didn't simplify. He pushed through, maintaining the tempo, hitting every note cleanly. The music built and built, climbing toward the climax like someone running toward freedom. The final notes cascaded down like falling stars, bright and perfect and fleeting, and then silence. Daniel's hands hovered over the keys for a moment. He was breathing hard, his heart racing. Sweat had formed on his forehead. His fingers trembled slightly from the exertion. The ballroom remained utterly quiet. For a horrible second, Daniel thought he'd made a terrible mistake. That he'd somehow failed. That all his practice hadn't been enough. That he was about to face the humiliation his mother had feared. Then Mr. Henderson started clapping. Slow, deliberate applause that echoed through the silent room. His face showed something Daniel had never seen directed at him before. Respect, maybe even admiration. Others joined in. Tentatively at first, then with growing enthusiasm. The applause built like a wave, filling the ballroom. People weren't just being polite anymore. They were genuinely moved. Daniel stood up from the bench on shaky legs. He didn't know what to do with his hands. Didn't know where to look. This wasn't supposed to happen. People like him weren't supposed to have moments like this. The crowd had split into 2 distinct groups. Some were pressing forward, wanting to get closer to ask questions. Their faces showed genuine interest and surprise. These were the people who actually cared about music, who recognized what they'd just witnessed. But others hung back, whispering behind their hands. Their expressions ranged from uncomfortable to disapproving. These were Mrs. Henderson's friends, the people who cared more about social order than talent. To them, Daniel had committed some kind of violation. He'd stepped out of his place, crossed an invisible line that wasn't supposed to be crossed. Mrs. Henderson herself looked like she'd been turned to stone. Her face was pale, her mouth slightly open. Daniel could see the war happening behind her eyes. On one hand, her employee's son had just embarrassed her in front of her guests by being audacious enough to perform. On the other hand, he'd delivered something undeniably exceptional. Something that made her party memorable for reasons she hadn't planned. She didn't know which emotion to land on, so she just stood there, frozen. But it was Julian's reaction that Daniel found most interesting. The young pianist had moved closer to the piano during the performance. Now he stood just a few feet away, his champagne glass forgotten in his hand. His expression had gone through several transformations. First disbelief, then shock, then something that might have been jealousy, and finally settling into what looked like genuine respect. Their eyes met across the space. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Julian did something Daniel never expected. He extended his hand. The gesture silenced the room again. Everyone watched as Julian walked the last few steps to Daniel, his hand still outstretched. This was the moment that would define what came next. If Julian rejected him, dismissed his performance, the crowd would follow his lead. The magic of the moment would dissolve into awkwardness and social hierarchy. But if Julian acknowledged what had just happened, If he validated Daniel's talent in front of all these people, everything could change. Daniel reached out and shook his hand. Julian's grip was firm, and when he spoke, his voice carried across the quiet room. Who taught you? Not where did you study? Not what school did you go to? Just the simple question that cut to the heart of it. Who taught you to play like that? Daniel swallowed hard. Nobody taught me. I taught myself. Julian's eyes widened. That's impossible. La Campanella isn't something you can just pick up on your own. That piece requires years of formal training, proper technique, professional guidance. I watched videos, Daniel said quietly, and lessons. Through the door. The Henderson kids took lessons for years. I'd stand in the hallway and watch. Listen. Then I'd practice at night when everyone was asleep. He could see the information processing on Julian's face, the implications sinking in. At night, Julian repeated slowly. You mean you'd sneak in here? After everyone was asleep? Daniel nodded. For how long? 5 years. The number hung in the air. 5 years of secret practice. 5 years of stolen time. 5 years of developing a skill that by all rights he should never have had access to. Julian stared at him for a long moment. Then he turned to Mr. Henderson, who was still standing near the window. This is raw genius, Julian said, loud enough for everyone to hear. With proper training, with the right opportunities, he could be extraordinary. Better than extraordinary. He could be one of the best. The room erupted in murmurs. Some excited, some scandalized. But Daniel barely heard them. His mother had pushed through the crowd and was standing at the edge of his vision. Her face was wet with tears, though she was trying to hide it. Tears of pride mixed with fear, Daniel guessed. Pride at what he'd done, fear of what it might cost them. Mr. Henderson walked toward them slowly. His expression was unreadable. When he reached Daniel and his mother, he looked at them both for a long moment. Rosa, he said to Daniel's mother, how long have you worked for us? 18 years, sir, she said quietly. 18 years, he repeated. And in all that time I never knew your son could do this. He gestured to the piano. Why didn't you tell us? Rosa's voice trembled when she answered. It wasn't my place, sir. Daniel's gift. It's his. Not mine to advertise. And besides, who would have believed that a Maid's son could play like that? Mr. Henderson nodded slowly, and something in his expression softened. I need to speak with both of you. After the party. There's something we need to discuss. It wasn't a request. It was a statement. But his tone wasn't angry. If anything, it sounded almost thoughtful. The rest of the party passed in a blur. Daniel returned to his serving duties, but everything felt different now. People who had looked through him before were now staring at him. Some with curiosity, some with admiration, and some with thinly veiled disapproval. He caught fragments of conversations as he moved through the crowd with his tray. Did you see that? The help playing list! Absolutely remarkable. Natural talent like that is so rare. I don't know. Seems inappropriate if you ask me. There are boundaries. Oh, don't be such a snob, Patricia. The boy has a gift. Daniel kept his head down and focused on his work. His hands were still trembling slightly from the adrenaline, and his mind kept replaying those moments at the piano. Had that really just happened? Had he really just performed in front of all these people? Julian hadn't left yet. He stood near the bar, surrounded by guests who wanted to talk to him. But Daniel noticed his eyes kept drifting over to where Daniel was working. Finally, about an hour before the party ended, Julian extracted himself from his admirers and walked over. Hey, he said quietly, can we talk for a minute? Daniel glanced around nervously, but no one seemed to be paying attention to them at the moment. Sure. They moved to a quieter corner of the ballroom away from the main crowd. Julian ran his hand through his hair, a gesture that made him look younger and less polished than before. I owe you an apology, Julian said. What I said earlier about people being meant to create or serve, that was arrogant and cruel. And wrong. Daniel hadn't expected that. It's okay. No, it's not okay, Julian shook his head. I've been playing piano since I was 4 years old. My parents spent a fortune on my education. The best teachers, the best schools, every advantage money could buy. And I'm good. I know I'm good. But what you did up there, he gestured toward the piano, that wasn't just good. That was something else entirely. You're being too kind. I'm not. I'm being honest. Julian's expression turned serious. There's a difference between playing the notes correctly and making music. I was trained to play notes. You learned to make music? Do you understand the distinction? Daniel thought about his midnight practice sessions, about the way he'd learned to feel the music instead of just executing it. I think so. When I was at Juilliard, there was this phrase the teachers used. They'd say a student was technically perfect but musically dead. That's been haunting me for the past hour because I realized they could have been describing me. Julian laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. I've spent my whole life chasing perfection, trying to be the best, and somewhere along the way I forgot why I started playing in the first place. Why did you start? Julian was quiet for a moment. Because it was beautiful. Because making music felt like magic. But then it became about competitions and rankings and proving myself. The magic got lost somewhere. It doesn't have to be lost forever, Daniel said. Maybe not. Julian pulled a business card from his pocket and handed it to Daniel. This has my email and phone number. I'm serious about what I said earlier. You have extraordinary talent, but talent alone isn't enough. You need training, guidance, opportunities. I'd like to help with that if you'll let me. Daniel stared at the card, unable to believe what he was hearing. Why would you do that? Because watching you play reminded me of something important. And because someone helped me once when I was just starting out. A teacher who saw potential in me and took a chance. Maybe it's my turn to do the same for someone else. Before Daniel could respond, Mrs. Henderson's voice cut across the room. Daniel, there's work to be done. Julian gave him a small smile. We'll talk more. I promise. The party finally wound down around midnight. The guests left in their expensive cars, still talking about the unexpected performance. The catering staff packed up and departed. The house slowly returned to its normal state, though there were still signs of the evening everywhere. Champagne glasses to be collected, plates to be cleared, decorations to be taken down. Daniel and his mother worked in silence, cleaning up. Rosa hadn't said much to him since the performance. Daniel couldn't tell if she was angry or scared or proud. Maybe all three. Finally, as they were wiping down the last of the tables, Mr. Henderson appeared in the doorway. Rosa, Daniel, could you both come to my study, please? Daniel's stomach dropped. This was it. They were going to be fired. He'd been so caught up in the moment, in the music, that he hadn't thought about the consequences. And now his mother was going to lose her job because of him. They followed Mr. Henderson through the quiet house to his study, a wood-paneled room lined with books that Daniel suspected had never been read. Mrs. Henderson was already there, sitting in one of the leather chairs. Her face was unreadable. Mr. Henderson gestured for them to sit. Daniel and his mother perched on the edge of a sofa, holding hands. Daniel could feel how hard his mother's heart was beating through her palm. First, Mr. Henderson began, I want to make something clear. Neither of you are in trouble. Rosa's grip on Daniel's hand loosened slightly. What happened tonight was unexpected, Mr. Henderson continued. And I won't pretend it wasn't uncomfortable for some of our guests. But it was also remarkable. He looked directly at Daniel. You have an extraordinary gift, son. Thank you, sir. The question is, what do we do about it? Mr. Henderson leaned back in his chair. I need to tell you something that very few people know. Before I took over the family business, before all of this, he gestured around at the mansion. I was a music student. I had a scholarship to a conservatory. Daniel's eyes widened. He'd never known that. I wasn't particularly talented, Mr. Henderson said with a slight smile. I was adequate, competent, but I loved it. When my father died and I had to leave school to run the company, giving up music was the hardest thing I'd ever done. He paused. Tonight, watching you play, I saw something I recognized. That hunger, that need to create, it's rare, and it shouldn't be wasted. Mrs. Henderson shifted in her chair but remained silent. So here's what I'm proposing, Mr. Henderson said. I'd like to sponsor your education, Daniel. Full scholarship to study at a proper conservatory. Housing, tuition, expenses, everything covered. Daniel felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. He couldn't breathe. Couldn't think. This couldn't be real. His mother made a small sound, something between a gasp and a sob. There would be conditions, Mr. Henderson continued. You'd have to maintain your grades. You'd have to work hard. This wouldn't be a free ride. It would be an investment, and I'd expect you to honor that investment with your dedication. I would, Daniel managed to say. I'd work harder than anyone. I believe you would. Mr. Henderson smiled. Rosa, you've been loyal to this family for 18 years. You've raised a remarkable son while working full-time. I think it's time we acknowledge that properly. Your salary will be increased and you'll have better benefits. This isn't charity. It's what should have happened years ago. Rosa was crying now, not bothering to hide it. Sir, I don't know what to say. Thank you. Thank you so much, Mrs. Henderson finally spoke. Robert, can we discuss this privately? There's nothing to discuss, Margaret. My mind is made up. But what will people think? After tonight, the way he just inserted himself into the performance. They'll think, Mr. Henderson interrupted, his voice firm, that we recognized exceptional talent and had the wisdom to nurture it. That's what they'll think. Mrs. Henderson pressed her lips together but didn't argue further. Mr. Henderson turned back to Daniel. There's a conservatory about 3 hours from here. It's one of the best in the country. Julian Ashworth has contacts there. He's offered to help with your application and audition preparation. Julian did? He called me an hour ago. He's very impressed with you. He thinks with a few months of focused preparation, you'd be ready for their audition process. Daniel's mind was spinning. Everything was happening so fast. Just this morning, his biggest concern had been whether he'd have time to practice tonight. Now people were talking about conservatories and auditions and futures he'd never dared to imagine. I also spoke with the director of the conservatory. Mr. Henderson continued. Explained the situation. They're willing to listen to a recording of tonight's performance and fast-track your application if they're impressed. You recorded it? Daniel asked. Mr. Henderson smiled. I have cameras throughout the house for security. The ballroom is covered. I already have the footage. Rosa squeezed Daniel's hand. When he looked at her, she was smiling through her tears. You're going to study music, she whispered. Really study it. With teachers and everything. If you want to, Mr. Henderson added. This is your choice, Daniel. No one is forcing you, but the opportunity is there if you want it. Daniel thought about the past 5 years, the midnight sessions, the fear of being caught, the constant hiding, the dream that had seemed impossible, and now it wasn't impossible anymore. It was real. It was right here in front of him. I want it, he said, his voice steady, more than anything. 3 months passed like a dream that Daniel kept expecting to wake up from. But he didn't wake up. This was real, all of it. Julian had been true to his word. He'd shown up the week after the gala and started working with Daniel. Real proper lessons, not just playing together, but breaking down technique, discussing interpretation, fixing small habits that Daniel had developed teaching himself. You've got some bad fingering in the left hand here, Julian would say, stopping him mid-piece. See? If you use your fourth finger instead of your third, the transition is smoother. It was strange at first having someone correct him. For 5 years, Daniel had been his own teacher, making decisions based on what sounded right or what felt natural. Now he was learning that there were reasons for certain techniques, strategies that had been developed over centuries by people who dedicated their lives to piano. But Julian never made him feel stupid for not knowing. He just taught him, patiently and thoroughly. They worked together 3 times a week, usually in the afternoon when Julian's schedule allowed. Mr. Henderson had converted one of the mansion's unused guest rooms into a proper practice space for Daniel, complete with the Steinway from the ballroom. Daniel still couldn't quite believe he was allowed to play it whenever he wanted now. No more sneaking around. No more fear. His mother had cried the first time she'd seen him practicing openly in that room, playing in daylight with the door wide open. The conservatory audition was scheduled for early January. That gave Daniel about 3 months to prepare. It didn't sound like much time, but Julian insisted it was enough. You already have the hardest part figured out, Julian told him during one of their sessions. You know how to make music. Now we're just polishing the technical aspects. Daniel was learning pieces he'd never attempted before. Chopin, Debussy, Bach. Each composer required a different approach, a different mindset. Julian taught him to research the historical context, to understand what the composer was trying to express. Music isn't just notes on a page, Julian explained. It's communication. When Chopin wrote this nocturne, he was in exile, homesick for Poland. That longing has to come through in your performance, not manufactured emotion, but real understanding of what he was feeling. It changed the way Daniel approached everything. He started visiting the library more, reading about composers' lives, learning about the periods they lived in. The music became richer, more meaningful, but it wasn't all easy. There were frustrating days when his fingers wouldn't cooperate, when pieces that had seemed manageable suddenly felt impossible. Days when Daniel wondered if he was really good enough, if this whole thing was a mistake. Julian always seemed to know when those doubts crept in. "Every musician goes through this," he said during one particularly difficult session. "You think I don't have days where I want to quit? Where I listen to recordings and think I'll never be that good? It's part of the process. But you went to Juilliard. You had years of training, and you taught yourself La Campanella by sneaking into a ballroom at midnight," Julian countered. "Do you know how insane that is? Most students at top conservatories couldn't do what you did. Stop comparing yourself to everyone else and just focus on getting better than you were yesterday." The advice helped. Daniel learned to measure his progress not against other pianists but against himself, and he was improving, rapidly. Skills that should have taken years to develop were clicking into place in months because he already had the foundation. He'd built it himself, one stolen practice session at a time. Word had spread about him. Some of Mrs. Henderson's friends had posted videos from the gala on social media, and they'd gone viral. Not hugely viral, but enough that music blogs and local news stations had picked up the story. The Maid's son who taught himself to play Liszt. Daniel found it uncomfortable, all the attention. He wasn't used to being seen, let alone celebrated. But Julian helped him navigate it. "Just be honest," Julian advised. "Tell your story. Don't exaggerate, don't diminish. Just be real. That's what people connect with." Daniel did a few interviews, always feeling awkward in front of cameras, but he talked about his mother's sacrifices, about the piano that had been his teacher, about the dream he'd never thought possible. People responded to it. Messages poured in from other kids in similar situations, asking for advice, sharing their own hidden talents. It made Daniel realize his story was bigger than just him. It was about all the kids who were told they weren't good enough, weren't the right kind of person, didn't come from the right background. Every time he sat at the piano now, he carried them with him. Finally, January arrived. The audition was on a Tuesday morning at the conservatory. Mr. Henderson had arranged for a car to drive Daniel, Rosa, and Julian to the campus. Mrs. Henderson had wished them luck, though she still seemed uncertain about the whole situation. Some things didn't change overnight. The conservatory was beautiful. Old stone buildings surrounded by trees with practice rooms where Daniel could see students working through windows. This could be his life, if he passed the audition. The waiting room was full of other applicants. Kids who looked polished and confident, carrying expensive instrument cases, talking about their teachers and their previous performances. Daniel felt out of place in his borrowed suit, his hands sweating. Julian noticed. "Hey, remember you belong here as much as anyone. More than most, actually. They all look so prepared. And you are prepared. You've been preparing for 5 years. You just did it differently." Julian put a hand on his shoulder. "Go in there and play the way you played at the gala. Not for them. For yourself. For the music." "Daniel Rivera?" A woman with a clipboard appeared in the doorway. This was it. Daniel stood on shaky legs. His mother hugged him tight. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered. "No matter what happens." The audition room was smaller than he'd expected. A grand piano sat in the center, and 3 judges sat behind a table, their expressions neutral. Professional. They introduced themselves, but Daniel immediately forgot their names. His heart was pounding too loud to hear properly. "Whenever you're ready," one of them said. Daniel sat at the piano, took a breath, let his fingers find their home on the keys. He'd chosen to play 3 pieces, a Bach prelude, a Chopin nocturne, and the piece that had started everything, La Campanella. Julian had argued against including it, saying it was too risky, too flashy. But Daniel had insisted. This was the piece that had given him courage that night at the gala. It felt right to play it again now. He started with Bach. Let the mathematical precision of the counterpoint settle his nerves. The piece was like a conversation between voices, each line weaving around the others. Daniel had learned to think of it as different people talking, agreeing and disagreeing, finding harmony. Then Chopin, the nocturne that Julian had taught him, the one written in exile. Daniel thought about his mother leaving her country, coming to America alone and pregnant, building a life in the shadows of other people's wealth. The music carried that longing, that bittersweet mix of loss and hope. And finally, La Campanella. This time was different from the gala. At the gala, he'd been playing to prove himself, to show everyone he wasn't what they assumed. Now he was playing because he loved it. Because this music was part of him, because he couldn't imagine his life without it. His fingers flew across the keys with the speed and precision the piece demanded, but he wasn't thinking about technique anymore. He was just letting the music happen, letting it flow through him the way it always had during those midnight sessions when no one was watching. When the final note faded, Daniel sat still for a moment. Then he stood and faced the judges. They were whispering to each other, looking at papers, making notes. Their faces gave nothing away. Finally, the woman in the middle looked up. "Mr. Rivera, can you tell us about your training?" He explained it all again. The midnight practice, the library books, the YouTube videos, teaching himself to read music. 5 years of secret learning. "And you've only been working with a professional instructor for 3 months?" "Yes, ma'am. Mr. Ashworth has been teaching me since October." More whispering. More notes. Daniel's palms were sweating. "We'll be in touch within a week with our decision," the woman said. "Thank you for your time," that was it. No hints about how he'd done. No reactions he could read. Just professional politeness and dismissal. The ride back to the mansion was quiet. Daniel stared out the window, replaying every moment, every note, wondering what he could have done better. Julian tried to reassure him, but Daniel barely heard it. The week that followed was the longest of Daniel's life. He tried to practice, but his mind kept wandering. Tried to focus on other things, but everything felt pointless compared to waiting for that decision. Finally, on Friday afternoon, Rosa came running into the practice room. Waving an envelope. "It came," she said breathlessly. "The letter from the conservatory." Daniel's hands were shaking so badly he could barely open it. Julian and his mother stood on either side of him, waiting. He pulled out the letter and read the first line. "Dear Mr. Rivera, we are pleased to inform you." He didn't need to read the rest. Those words were enough. "Pleased to inform you." That meant yes. That meant he'd done it. "I got in," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Then louder, "I got in."